Welcome everyone, lovely to have everyone here and thanks for making the time. So as Johan said, I'm going to talk about community engagement and specifically the co-development of incentives for coexistence, and my email is at the end of the PowerPoint presentation. So if I forget to put it in the chat, you can always follow up with it there. All right, so just to talk about my work a little bit. Most of my work focuses on lions, not only lions, but large carnivores in general. And lions and other large carnivores have always had huge value to people across the world. So this picture on the left is something called the Lion Man, and this was carved out of woolly mammoth ivory about 40,000 years ago. It's the first time that people had figurative art, and it happened to be the head of a lion on the body of a human. And similarly on the right, you can see this is from France. These are cave paintings that were drawn about 30,000 years ago and showing all the kinds of behavior that any one of us would see now if we went out into the Serengeti or the Mara. And just amazing to see that these animals way back then even were so compelling to people and so valuable and so important in their culture that they really represented them extensively. And those values have really sort of been maintained all the way through history. And they've got lots and lots of different values. So they've got ecological values, so top carnivores, you know, if you have top carnivores in a landscape, then you've also got healthy prey populations, you've got sufficient habitat, you've got kind of a functioning ecosystem. They also provide economic value to the range countries in which they occur, so for things like photographic tourism and trophy hunting in some countries. And there's also just existence value. People across the world, and often those furthest from living with, say, species like lions, just really, really value the fact that they still live in a world that is wild enough for these animals to actually exist in, to have a world where you can have wild lions and wild elephants and wild bears, etc. There is something really attractive, but as I say, particularly if you're not the ones actually living with them. But despite all of that international value, in particular, species like lions are really in serious trouble. So this is a map of historic lion range. So they used to be distributed right the way across Africa. This is the estimate down in 1890. There was somewhere around 200,000 lions left. Now, this was a real guesstimate of the number of lions. Obviously, no one was really doing systematic surveys then, but basically they occurred all the way through sub-Saharan Africa with the exception of the Congo Basin. By 1970, that had really collapsed in terms of a huge fragmentation of the range, but there was still a large amount of lion range through this kind of crescent all the way from southern and eastern Africa up through just below the Sahara. And the number then again, very much a guesstimate, perhaps around 75,000 lions. Situation now in 2020 is really much more depressing. So much more fragmented lion populations. We think there are somewhere around 67 lion populations left, wild lion populations. You'll see that South Africa, which has lots of the game farms, isn't represented here in terms of wild lions. But we think that there's somewhere around 24,000 wild lions left in these populations. And the main threats driving that are human-wildlife conflict, habitat loss, and the loss of wild prey through things like bushmeat snaring. Now, Lion Landscapes is the organisation that I'm the joint CEO of, and I run it together with Elaine Cotterill. She's mainly based out in Kenya, whereas I have been running more of the work that's been happening in Tanzania. And so we have 4 different landscapes, 4 of the very important lion landscapes left that we work in. We work in Runguruaha in southern Tanzania. We work in Saluniere, also in southern Tanzania. We work in the Laikipia area of Kenya, and we work in the Luangwa Valley in Zambia. And in most of our lion landscape sites, people tend to be very, very poor. So most of these people are living on less than $1 a day. Food insecurity is a major concern. Often people aren't able to make sure that they have 3 meals a day. Sometimes people can't even have 2 meals a day. There's very little access to clean water or improved sanitation. So diseases like cholera and Giardia are endemic. Obviously a major issue for things like COVID as well. There's little or no access to many of the people in the remote areas to high quality medical care, and the life expectancy in some of the sites is around 50 years old. There's very high levels of illiteracy, particularly for women. So in southern Tanzania, of the household heads, 75% of the household heads who are women had no literacy at all. So very, very hard for people to move forward. And that poverty really restricts the future options. So it's very hard to change your future if you're trapped in this cycle of poverty, particularly if you're illiterate, etc. And then you've got these people living right beside some of the most important wildlife populations in the world. They're living right alongside big protected areas. or sometimes in the case of Laikipia, sort of big private lands where you've got lots of this wildlife still maintained on it. But all these areas are very important for lions, for leopards, wild dogs, hyenas, and those can, as everyone knows, incur significant costs on local people. So in this case, this man had 3 cattle. They were attacked by lions. They killed one of the cattle. He went and he put out poison and unsurprisingly then killed several lions. And this happens over and over again. And so this was just the very first year of some of our work down in southern Tanzania, huge amounts of lion killing. In fact, this was the highest recorded rate of lion killing anywhere in modern times. And if you looked at it, 2 things jumped out at us. In addition to the sheer numbers of animals that were being killed, there were 2 quite striking elements. The first was that a lot of the lions were missing their right front paw. Now, often nothing else was missing on the body, just this paw, and it had clearly been cut off. We had no idea why this was happening. Secondly, a lot of the animals that were being killed were heavily pregnant females. So you'd go to them and they'd be literally have cubs ready to be born, and that's devastating. If there's any way of driving a population down, it is by taking out the reproductively active females. So we knew this was a huge conservation concern. And poisonings are particularly devastating. Around half the animals that we're dealing with were killed within poison. This was one instance where we had a collared lion that had a mortality signal. We went to respond to it, and we found not the 1 lion that was dead, we found 6 lions that had been killed and over 75 critically endangered vultures. So huge amounts of impact on wildlife, particularly through poisoning, and that was driven mainly by this kind of conflict between people and wildlife. So obviously critical to engage people in conservation, try to work out better solutions. How can we co-develop these incentives to try to improve coexistence for both people and for wildlife? But it's very hard to do because often people don't want to engage in conservation. They don't trust conservationists, and often for good reason. And so in this case, particularly around Ruaha in southern Tanzania, there was a huge amount of hostility and a lack of willingness to engage with us. So we knew when we talked to people that the majority of the lion killings were done by a tribe called the Barabeg, that we hadn't had much to do with because the Barabeg traditionally are very hostile towards outsiders. They just had no intention of engaging with conservationists and particularly with foreigners. And so we set up our field camp on village land. We worked with the village authorities. We got permission to set up the small tented camp. We thought it'd be good just to be right there amongst the Barabeg to try to understand which challenges they were facing and to work with them. But for more than 2 years, we tried everything in the book. We tried the community meetings. We tried to go to the elders. We tried to talk with people, to invite people to our camp. Nothing happened. And we really thought, well, maybe it's true. Maybe we can't work with the Barabeg. Maybe it's an impossible challenge to try to work with them in conservation. Then we happened to put up solar panels in camp to charge our laptops. And then suddenly the Barabeg turned up to charge their mobile phones. And it still kills me today. It's such an obvious point to every one of us who's spent a long time in Africa. The same as anywhere else, mobile phones are absolutely critical to the way people live. And this is no different from the Barabeg as to anyone else. You know, they have used their mobile phones for tracking livestock prices, for reporting if children have gone missing in the bush, for reporting if livestock have gone missing, just for sharing jokes and memes and everything else. So just like anyone else, they valued the mobile phones, and that enabled them to come to camp. And it was the first connection they had with us. And it really reminded me not to look at this from what we can how we can form a bridge with the community, but how can we offer the community something that is valuable to them? And in this case, it was a charging station. And that enabled people to start to come down, start to learn more about what we did, and to just grow a relationship. And eventually they agreed to come down to have a meeting with us at camp and to talk about the lion killing. And this was great. We explained to them, we are not the Wildlife Division, we are not the National Parks Authority. We're just trying to understand why you kill this many lions and whether there is a way that you could achieve whatever you're achieving through it without so much negative conservation impact. And this was a really good meeting. And we felt a real high because they said, okay, we'll work with you. And honestly, the highest point of our project. And then within a few days, those same group of men went out and they killed 7 lions right around camp. And this was the lowest part of the project by far. It was really depressing. And I called up a friend of mine, Leela Hazar, who works in Kenya, works on Lion Guardians. I said to her, I cannot do this anymore. We can't engage with people. And she said, this is a test. You've explained to the communities that you value your relationship with them. They know you value lions, and they're now seeing which you value more, lions or your relationship with the community. And so she said, you've got to do nothing. So sure enough, we did nothing. We measured the carcasses. Everyone knew we knew, and nothing happened. And then about a few days later, they called us down to meet them at their traditional meeting. This was the first time they'd had outsiders at one of their meetings, certainly the first time they'd had a Westerner there. And this was probably the biggest learning curve for me in the project, was just understanding that sometimes to build those engagements, to build that community relationship, you have to give up a bit of what you prioritize, just to show that that relationship with the community is more important than the relationship almost that you have, with the wildlife and for you as a conservationist. So once we got that relationship with them, we could understand more about what the actual drivers of conflict were. And a lot of it was the thing that you would just expect. Depredation, attacks on livestock are usually the very first thing that people talk about in terms of conflict. And so we do multiple things with lion landscapes to trying to reduce depredation and attacks on livestock. One of the ways that we've done it is something called collaring for coexistence, where we collar lions, and rather than just keeping that information to ourselves about where the problem lions are, we share that on a live app with the local livestock keepers so they can see where the lions are. And everyone thought this was madness at first, because they said, well, people are going to know where the lions are and they're just going to kill them. But actually they didn't, because they felt included, because they felt empowered, and part of it, they didn't go out and kill those specific lions. And there's been much, much more desire for more people to get this kind of access, because they just feel more safer and more informed about it. I think that's really important. We've got to trust people with information, with partnerships, not just assume the worst of them. We found that 2/3 of the attacks happened in poorly constructed livestock enclosures. And so we've ended up fortifying those with diamond mesh fencing. This has been really effective. It's reduced attacks by about 95% in those enclosures. What you don't want to do is just protect livestock overnight and then let them out in the morning to slightly hungrier predators the next day. So we also worked with livestock guarding dogs to place the first 10 livestock guarding dogs in East Africa. Now, these look ridiculous when you take them out to farmers or to pastoralists and say, look, this is going to be your solution. They're like, have you ever seen a lion? This thing looks like a snack. But actually they grow up to be into very effective guardians, very big dogs, a little bit too big, because again, we're dealing with a lot of people who have food insecurity and aren't able to cover the costs of this. So we're looking at crossbreeding these dogs with village dogs to see how effective that might be. We also work with people who have mobile enclosures, so can't use the wire mesh. And these canvas ones are ones that we learned about from Zimbabwe. So we sent a team over there, and it's very, very simple, but obviously you cluster all the cattle in there. It seems to be very protective, not only because the predators can't see through, but because the rattling and the reflection on the canvas, the predators really don't like it. So these have been really effective at reducing attacks, but also, interestingly, they have a really strong impact on fertilizing the soil and improving food security. So this, for example, is where the boma was on the left-hand side here, and this is outside the boma. And you can see where the maize growth here on the boma plots is much, much higher than untreated. So we're now using this as a way of improving food security as well. Also really important to make sure you have targeted response across the landscape. So we use lion rangers. These are people who are up in the conservancies in Laikipia, and making sure that there are people in place that are trained, that are able to respond quickly to events of conflict and engage the communities is really important. We also run coexistence co-ops, and this is a way of, rather than sort of telling people what to do, we work with them on solutions that they feel might work and that they actually can train and get involved in and implement themselves. So this is a really important way of building that local knowledge and skills training. So we can reduce attacks, and that's all been very successful, but it's really important to notice there are many more impacts that drive conflict than just attacks on livestock, for example. There are a few of these key ones: the lack of meaningful, equitable benefits from conservation or living with wildlife. This is a huge topic. There's also cultural issues, and this was so important when we talked to the warriors about understanding what was happening actually in some of these landscapes. So amongst the Barabeg, they explained that a young man will go out and kill a lion, not just for an age ceremony, but to prove status in the community. So when they go out and they kill the lion, the warrior that throws the first spear gets to cut off this right front paw. He takes a claw of it and he wears it on an amulet on his arm here. And he goes around the community and he tells them about the hunt, and he gets gifts of cattle, which is obviously an important form of wealth. And also he gets status from people, and particularly from women. So it was vital for us to understand those cultural drivers. And there was also a huge lack of conservation awareness. People just didn't understand why we would care about lions when there seems to be plenty of lions around here. So vital, first of all, to think about those lack of benefits. So, and as the whole point of this talk is, how do we co-develop community benefit initiatives? And that comes really from listening to people, from being out there, from being willing to really understand which benefits they would value from the presence of wildlife. And they came up with 3 top priorities: education, healthcare, and veterinary medicine. The same things that probably any one of us would come up with in their position. So we've tackled each of these, and initially we started working with them on sort of the classic benefit program. So we supported 16 schools with educational materials. We provide over 60 Simba scholarships. So this is where we're funding children to go all the way through secondary school, particularly from pastoralist backgrounds. This is the only time we went against the community because they didn't want us to give these to girls. They said that if you invest money in girls, they'll get married, they'll get pregnant, it's a waste of time. And so we said, no, we want half of them to go to girls, because all the data shows that for every year of, every extra year of investment in their education has a huge impact on their future lives and even the lives of their children. And this has actually really been transformative. Now we've seen these girls go all the way through secondary school, more and more girls going through, and they really are making a change in that. Then they go on, some of them to college, and to come back, we're supporting some through college as well. They come back to their communities and they're really showing that that investment in female education is really important. We found that children weren't doing well at school. When we talked to the teachers about that, they said it's because they didn't have enough food. There was no opportunity for food at school, and people were walking in the morning with no breakfast. So people, of course, couldn't concentrate. So we developed this porridge project, simple maize meal, eggs, etc., peanuts. We feed over 1,000 children every day. This was one that seems so far removed from conservation when you talk to donors, but in the communities, this is what they value probably more than anything else. So, and this is not sort of conditional on anything else. We just invest in the porridge project because we think it's the right thing to do to show that commitment to the communities. And it's one that is really appreciated in this particular context. We also enabled access to better medical care. We've worked with the local authorities on better equipping clinics, with a particular focus on maternal and neonatal health care as well, because that was a top priority, particularly for the women. And also we invest in better veterinary medicines and better care through things like access to better medicines, etc. So that was really, really important. But the benefits we found, people really liked the fact the benefits were there. They would wave at us, but they were still killing the wildlife. And it's not surprising, because those benefits were being linked to the project and the presence of the project, but not specifically to the presence of wildlife. And I think this is something really critical that we often miss. So then we worked with the communities. At the same time, we had camera traps out to try to do ecological surveys, but the camera traps were getting stolen because people weren't feeling invested in them. So instead of doing this, we thought, let's bring it together. And rather than us camera trap on village land, we will get the communities to place camera traps. And then we worked with them on a system where for every image of a wild animal they got on their land, there'd be a certain number of points associated with it that they would get. And those points would be translated into additional community benefits. So they could very clearly see that it's the presence of wildlife that was driving the benefits. This took a long time to develop, because we had to work out how many points there were per species. I wanted a simple system of 1 to 5 points. They wanted thousands of points, fine. So now we have, for instance, 1,000 points if anyone camera traps a dik-dik, say. We have 1,500 points for any primate that's captured. So we give more points if they cause more conflict and they're more threatened. It's per individual animal. So this image would get them 1,000 points and then 1,500 points for the baboon. We give more for carnivores because they cause more conflict. So a spotted hyena would be 10,000 points. A lion would be 15,000 points. And the top spot was the African wild dog at 20,000 points. Now, as I mentioned, it is every individual. So this spot from one of the waterholes gave the village concerned 340,000 points. And actually this waterhole was a really great example of how it can work. This waterhole used to be a hot spot for poisoning, where people would go and put poison in the water and then put snares around it. After the camera trapping program, they ended up protecting the waterhole and protecting the camera traps there. And now it's a real sort of thriving area for the wildlife to come in, because they knew they could benefit from this program. We realized snaring is an issue, so we give 0 points for snared animals. And we give extra points for highly traded animals like pangolins. Those points are translated into additional health, education, and veterinary benefits. So each 3 months, we give out about $5,000 worth of benefits, depending on how many points they got. And it really does increase tolerance for wildlife on village land. We see much more tolerance of breeding lions, even, for example, on village land. And this pangolin was caught when they wanted to release it back, because it was known to be such an important animal to get on the camera traps. That community camera trapping program is now being used internationally. This is from Niassa in Mozambique, where it's been really important at providing more security, even in times of real civil unrest. And interestingly, it engages women in particular in conservation. So because a third of those benefits are given to healthcare and another third is given to education, women are really invested. And at one point we had the women stand up when a group of young men had gone out on a lion hunt, and they called them back in, something we could never have done. And they said, you are killing the very things that are enabling us to give birth safely and educate our children. We're not having it. And they put a ban on lion and elephant hunting in that village, against the will of the younger men, but they really exerted their power. And that was wonderful to see women really stepping up and having that role. We also address cultural issues of money and status. So we've worked with Lion Guardians to develop a new program called Lion Defenders, but again, where men in particular can play that traditional warrior role and can be out there tracking lions, warning the communities, protecting livestock, but they get money every month because we pay them, and they also get status. They get the money so they can buy cattle, but they also get training. They can use GPSs, they can learn how to read and write, and they get to travel. So they really become the top guys in the community. And actually, some women came up to us once and they said, we used to want our girls to marry lion killers, but now we want them to marry lion defenders because they've got these skills such as reading or writing. They're going to be really useful in the future. Improving conservation awareness, we take people into the local protected areas. And this is really important, just that people get the ability to see wildlife in an area that is non-threatening. We also show educational DVDs educational DVDs. One of the major issues is this tend to be in English, and that is very exclusive. I mean, even though people love to watch the images, because it's in English, the very clear message is this is not for you, this is not your story, and that's a really damaging message for people to get. So we've been working with people to develop children's stories. These are in Swahili and in English. There's Dara the Lion Defender and there's Hiker the Hyena Friend, both talking about the importance of conservation, but from a community perspective. And if we step back a bit, we take a broader focus on African conservation leadership. So we're doing these things. We're really trying to work on mentorship and interns and partnerships to build that leadership and share any of these approaches at a wider scale. And we know this can be effective. So in the core areas that we've monitored, depredation has been reduced by over 60%. So that's helping relieve that burden on local families. And importantly for us, the carnivore killing has been reduced by over 70%. And it is having really positive impacts for people and for wildlife, particularly women. And this is Grace, for example, who has gone through our Simba Scholarship Programme. She's now come back to work with us as a research assistant. So she can really talk about the transformational impact that these programmes can have. But there's a real risk if you lower the poverty, which is of course what you want to do, that it can result in people investing in more livestock. That from a biodiversity perspective can be very damaging. So what we need to do is that we need to think bigger again, is how do we change the current wealth drivers? So at the moment, and this is a really complicated graph, goats, for instance, equal money. And so if you have money, you buy more goats, very simple. Now, wildlife does not equal more money. If anything, it reduces your goats and your cattle and therefore costs you money. You have to go out and protect your livestock. And therefore, this situation ends up in fewer wildlife. So we need to change that situation around. So conservation efforts have got to focus much more on wealth creation rather than just focusing on poverty alleviation. And critically, we have to think about how do we decouple that wealth as much as possible from livestock numbers, with more of a focus on livestock health and quality. And that's obviously a challenge to do, particularly when there's a real cultural aspect of livestock numbers being important. But the ideal in terms of conservation is that wealth should be coupled far more with biodiversity, with more of a focus on ensuring that people can benefit properly from those wild resources. So we're creating new revenue streams from conservation, for instance, lion carbon. This is a premium carbon offset, which is working in top areas for lions. And this is happening in the Luangwa Valley with biocarbon partners, where people can buy this, and that lion, the extra value then goes into biodiversity monitoring, to making sure that these benefits that are going to the communities are also benefiting biodiversity and safeguarding these landscapes. We have to make sure that revenue streams integrate into existing revenue streams, for instance, livestock. So we're now developing a lion-friendly livestock process where we've got criteria for certification. We're also looking at that sort of methodology to calculate carnivore credits so that, again, investors can invest in landscapes which have biodiversity as well as having livestock, as well as having people. And then they can be lion-friendly certified. And then there can be either premium amounts go back to the producers, or it can be just a more efficient cycle, basically more efficient economic chain, so that, again, the producers of it get more money, and then that increases the income for the certified producers, incentivizes, sustainable rangeland production, incentivizes the maintenance of biodiversity, and makes people wealthier. So this is the kind of thing that we focus on a lot, and it's something we've got to do. Because ultimately, if you want to have coexistence, that value has to be felt by the local people. And as I touched on right at the beginning, we had this situation tens of thousands of years ago where the people living closest to lions were the ones who really valued them. They were at least central. I'm sure they were still imposing all these costs, but they were still important enough to be sort of immortalized in art and in sculpture, etc. And what we've got to do is make sure that the values now are not just felt internationally, that we work very hard with all these different audiences to translate that value down to the local people, to make sure that these are the people who actually value lines. These are the people who see those benefits if we want to have a long-term coexistence between people and by wildlife. And that comes from really working with those people and really making sure that we listen to what they need and to some extent prioritizing their needs above ours. Thank you very much. And that's the Lion Landscapes website and my email as well.
Please and use the reaction tools at the bottom of the screen. You're also welcome to ask your questions in the chat. So I'm just scrolling through the chat quickly to see if we have any questions already there. We have a thank you already. From Jane Hamuyuhaki from Kenya, 2021 Panther student from Wild Crew, Oxford University. Nice talk, Amy. It was great to see and hear the amazing work that you are doing.
That's always nice. More questions, more comments like that are good. Good to see you, Jane, virtually. So great always to see Panthers back again.
I see there's just a general question to share screen. Hi, everyone. Is it possible to share the presentation with me? Yes, we will be sharing this presentation on the YouTube channel of Share Screen Africa. So we will post the link in the chat so you can access it from there. There we go. I see Marit has already done that. Thank you very much, Marit. I see Sarah Jones raised her hand. Sarah, please go ahead. You're welcome to unmute and ask your question.
Thank you, Sharon Jones, and thank you, Amy, for your presentation. It was very good. I had two questions. I know here in Kenya, we have innovation where I think it was a young Maasai boy developed these lights that flash to deter lions. Have you ever tried those down there, or do you have something equivalent? And then my second question was to do with how you're fencing the bomas. I see you're using chain link, and I wondered how effective that is compared to the traditional thorny boma type that used to be there. So I just wanted to hear your experience with that. Thank you.
Yep, thank you very much. So yes, Richard Terere was that young Kenyan boy who developed the lion lights, which was great. We have tried them in we've tried them multiple times actually. The first time was very sort of hamsini in that it sort of was okay, but it didn't really make much of a difference in terms of changing depredation. We've just finished another trial, which is a little bit more promising of them. And but interesting, even though they actually didn't change the depredation that much, what they did do was they made people feel more secure. So even if the science kind of showed that it wasn't that different, people just felt happier. They felt again that you're taking it seriously, that you're investing in it. So that in itself is worthwhile in terms of reducing conflict and focusing on coexistence. So it does really have benefits. It's something again that it's just another tool to add to it. So particularly for more remote, more nomadic people who are moving around, then it could be something that's useful. In terms of the fencing, so yes, one of the issues that we were finding is that just isn't much good thorn bush often around, and that people, so you can end up with a lot of the sort of the bush clearance, even for the traditional bomas. And these fencing ones are much better than the traditional bomas, the chain link fence. They're about 6 foot high. They do have to be maintained, but it's sunk into the bottom of the ground. So you would find in the thorn bush ones that there'd often just be a small enough hole that the livestock would push against, that then there'll be an access point for predators. And having also a good gate or a good door on that was really important as well. So we do definitely find the chain link is important. It doesn't work as well as I touched on for mobile pastoralists. And for those people, either the traditional thorn bush or things like the canvas could be good. So yeah, so it's slightly variable, but we found a significant difference by putting in the chain link fencing compared to the thorn bush.
Thanks, Sharon. Thank you for the question. Amy, another question from the chat from Vanina. I have a question for Amy. How did you train livestock guarding dogs? Did people learn quickly how to train them?
Yeah, so interestingly, livestock guarding dogs are very innate, the types of breed that we use. So we use Anatolian shepherd dogs that have been bred for sort of tens of thousands of years to protect against wolves and bears and things like that in Turkey originally. So what they have is this innate sort of desire to be with a group of livestock and to be protective. They don't attack predators. People often think that they go out there and they actually sort of will attack them or chase them. That's not their role. If they sense danger, they place themselves between the herd and the danger, and they bark a lot, and that should ideally wake up a herder and generate more of a response. So the only sort of training they get specifically is as soon as they're tiny, you put them in with the livestock, they're bonded with the livestock, they basically think, sorry, they're a sheep or a goat or whatever, so they're completely mentally messed up, but they are effective at what they do. And so they don't take that much training, although you've got to look out for around 6 months old, this sort of very playful phase they go for, which can result then in them chasing livestock and starting actually to kill livestock themselves. So you've just got to make sure that you've got that kind of ongoing relationship, that you don't just ditch them with people and leave them to it, because they can be quite challenging at that stage as well.
Okay, Amy, just a question from my side. In Kenya or in East Africa, are they trained by the parks authorities or conservation bodies or the dogs? I know in South Africa, there was actually at one stage a breeding program by South African national parks that supplied them to communities surrounding the parks.
Oh, really? I don't think I actually knew that they were actually sort of distributing like that down there. Not in East Africa I'm aware of at all. So there's obviously a real interest in it. We did, as I touched on, we worry a bit about the size of these dogs and the fact that maybe actually what you really need is people investing in dogs. Just you feed them enough, you bond them with the livestock, you expect that. So people would seem much more willing to do that with a specialized breed of dog, even though actually it's a lot more hassle to look after it. So we're going to be looking at this crossbreeding and potentially even using local dogs. I know in Botswana, they've had really good success with using local dogs to do that same kind of training program, but not needing that inherent breed. So it is something that I think needs more, but in short, no, I'm not aware of any parks authorities or authorities distributing them in any way.
Okay. I see another comment and question from Vicky in the chat. Thanks, Amy, for a really nice talk. Do you still see retaliation when livestock are killed by lions or other predators? Or have you found the incentives are enough to prevent retaliation?
Yeah, thanks. That's obviously a critical question. So there is still retaliation, there is still some poisoning, there is still some traditional hunts that's gone down quite a lot. So I think our aim is very much to get these things down to a stage where they're not a major conservation threat, or they're not a major threat to people's livelihood. So we're trying to, in both sides of the equation, get it to a stage where it's tolerable from those things. And that means you will never, I don't believe you'll ever get rid of conflict entirely. You'll never get rid of retaliation or even preventative killing entirely. What we're trying to do is just really reduce it from the level that it was at, and that is happening. So we're seeing that the attacks have gone down, so there's less need for retaliation. And when attacks happen, there doesn't seem to be as quick of a rush to retaliate. And we also do things like trainings on poisoning awareness and the risks of poisoning and things like that, so that hopefully if people do retaliate, if there are genuine problem animals, for example, there can be a different way of working with us to help respond to that, rather than just going out and lacing poison and creating those issues. So it's never going to be perfect. We're never going to get to zero, and we're never going to get to zero killings, but we are getting to a stage where we're sort of co-developing these things and thinking about it together.
Fantastic. I think your slide showed a 70% reduction in the lion killings, which I think is amazing.
So there's a Consolata Jitao. It says, thanks, are fences sustainable in terms of cost of construction? Are the bomas affordable to the pastoralists? Thank you. Have you managed to fence all bomas in your region? If the community is nomadic, do they demolish the bomas and move them to new areas?
Okay, yeah. So, okay, to take those bit by bit. So are the fences sustainable? It depends what is meant by sustainability, really. I mean, they need maintenance. It depends on the construction. So the wire fence ones we will replace over time. So the way that we agree with it is that we provide 75% of the costs and the households provide 25% of the cost. So often people have to maybe sell a goat to be able to do that. And then they are responsible for the repair and for upkeep on it, and we check them regularly. We've got conflict officers who go and check those regularly. So they're not sustainable and they're going to last forever, but they are going to help just reduce attacks at that boma. And in terms of affordability, there'll be some cases where if someone's had a real attack on their livestock and suddenly they want a boma, then we will go in and we will construct it regardless. And through the coexistence co-op work, a lot of the people are just investing themselves into doing BOMAs and sort of working on that. So rather than waiting for us to do it. So that's a slightly more locally driven approach. We haven't managed on, we're not really trying to fence all the BOMAs in the region. What we're doing is working on getting people to approach us if they want a BOMA. We monitor about 500 households every month, at least around Ruaha. And then we look at the ones that are getting lots of attacks and we try to approach them and their neighboring ones, because there are often clusters of attacks that go on. And in terms of nomadic BOMAs, yes, if they're truly nomadic, they just have a very small sort of temporary BOMA and then demolish it and move on. But it's interesting because people sort of almost part of their identity is being nomadic, but you talk to them about when they last moved and it might be 5 years ago or 6 years ago. So there's less actual movement than people often feel there is. So again, it's just talking to people about what they want and what most works for them.
Okay, maybe I can clarify. It was sustainability in terms of cost. Because if you have to help repair every time and if you have to construct all bombers, I think that is a bit costly. So,
for sure, yeah.
Sorry.
No, sorry, I was just going to say, for sure, this comes up a lot with a lot of this conflict mitigation things. A lot of the work that we do is about, what is the sustainability economically? Can this become self-sustaining? And my argument is always saying that actually, for the people who are living with this wildlife, the people who are the ones who are most likely to have the conflict and to kill them, we can't expect them to take on those costs of coexistence. We can't expect that to be something that's just born internally. So we do have to have external financing for this. And so in this case, with the BOMAs, for example, it's through the NGO that gets the funding from international donors and then does that. I think that is still a sustainable model. I mean, it's interesting through COVID that a lot of the more traditional sort of models, economic models that we saw fell away, the tourism, the trophy hunting, etc. But interestingly, philanthropy can continue to a large extent. So I think we need to be relying on international funding for some of this, and that shouldn't be something we shy away from. There are still lots of ways of getting in other revenue to support that, things like biodiversity credits or lion-friendly livestock, but ultimately we do need to be sourcing money internationally for this because we can't expect, I don't think, local people to bear additional costs of living with this wildlife.
Yeah, maybe an addition, you could, there's a system that is working in Kenya where you use earth rangers. That is, if the lions have trackers. So what you do, it's a geofence, which when a bomber is moving from one region to another, you only change the coordinates. So
Absolutely.
It's zero cost of construction. So the initial cost is the only cost that you incur.
Definitely, and that's a great, I mean, it's a great way of doing it. So we do use geofences, particularly, as you say, up in Kenya, in some of those landscapes. Of course, the initial cost of that collar is often much higher than the initial cost even of a BOMA. So it's again where we still need costing for this, and we still need financing. And I think we always shy away as conservationists from saying that we need money to do these things, and people expect it to be zero cost, and that's just not realistic. So we should be upfront that rather than all the costs being borne locally, we need some of those costs to go internationally, and whether that's using geofences or BOMAs or performance payments or any of those things, we need to just be open about that, I think. But yeah, it is a good model.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Consolata. Thank you for also participating and contributing sort of to your own, an answer to your own question as well. It's fantastic to hear from, what's happening in the field. I'd just like to ask, Amy, are there any way on your website or the NGO website where people can contribute or donate? If you'd like us to, if you could share a link, we can do that as well.
Yeah, for sure. On Lion Landscapes, there is a donate button there. So yeah, we always encourage anyone who wants to get involved that way. It's always good.
Fantastic. We need those small donations. They are also valuable. Regular small donations also make a difference. I see that Sharon Jones has got her hand raised, so I would just like to give her the opportunity to answer or to ask a question, please. Sharon, please unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thank you again. Actually, my question was for Amy. Just one more relating to the bombers. In Old Pejeta Conservancy, they have this thing, mobile bombers. I don't know if you've heard of those, but they're these metal bombers you can take apart and move with. And I wondered if that can be a more sustainable solution than the chain link that you're using, because of course, you can just reconstruct the boma on site, and the material, the metal material, lasts for decades even, and it's quite predator proof. So I just wondered if you've tried those, if you heard of them, and what your thoughts are about them. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Yeah, I've heard of them. And again, I think you just have to work out what works best locally. So obviously those are super useful up there. I mean, for most of the people we work with, at least in southern Tanzania, the roles of the predator-proof fencing is accessible, at least in local towns. So that's a big thing about just what's available locally for you. So that's why those sort of big rolls of wire are relatively easy to source, and they last quite a long time, and they're protective. So most of the people, that works well enough that we don't have to be looking at something else. So we're not having a major issue with kind of them falling apart or any of those sorts of things. For mobility, then we do tend to use things like the canvas bomas, because again, you can roll up the sheets of canvas, put them on the back of a donkey, move them somewhere else. And I think in those cases, again, locally where we are, that's a bit more mobile than having to actually transport a big sheet of, sheets of metal. But again, I think it's just for any person in these places, just finding out what is available and which works locally, and adapting it to local scenarios. So yeah, I think it's each site to their own, really, for anyone doing this kind of stuff.
From Angela Yang, it said, great presentation. Amy, thank you. The camera trap point system is fascinating. How expensive is this to implement? And is there a way to make this sustainable or self-sustaining?
Thank you. Yep. So how expensive is it? And the way that we work that is that we have 4 villages who are basically competing against each other, because if you're budgeting for that kind of thing, we needed to know what the ceiling was. If you end up X number of points per animal and you don't know how many animals you're going to get, you don't know how to budget your program. So we ended up having 4 villages kind of competing against each other, where we look at the points every month, and then every 3 months we distribute the benefits. And so for those villages, we distribute $5,000 worth of benefits. And the way it works is that the first village gets $2,000 worth, the second $1,500, the next $1,000, the next $500 worth. They request what is most designed from the community with their priority areas. We don't give the cash, we give the benefits, and then it all gets reset to 0 again. So that's kind of how it works. So basically for a group of 4 villages, it costs $20,000 per year. And we've got up to 3 groups at the moment, so obviously $60,000 per year. And that's excluding up the costs. So things like paying community camera trap officers, etc. So in total, it probably costs about $100,000 a year across the 12 villages there. In terms of making it sustainable, self-sustainable, by the way, it sounds quite a lot, but it's one of the most attractive things for donors by far, because it does both things. It like delivers community benefits and it really incentivizes conservation. So it's a really good sort of win-win. Is it a way to make it sustainable? Self-sustaining is kind of back to the original question about the bomas, that I really feel that we need to have international commitments to do this and to even up kind of where those costs and benefits lie at the moment. So I think we do still have to rely on international donations. That you could wind it in with things like credits or other forms of mechanism, or maybe with things like tourism, but to some extent that's no more sustainable. That's just a different way of generating the revenue. So again, we will need the funding for that.
Then I just want to thank our presenters for fascinating presentations and for the time that you put into it. Thank you for sharing your expertise. We really appreciate it.